The federal government's push to build a new pipeline from Alberta to Canada's west coast has been met with contention. But new polling by Ipsos shows that a majority of Canadians are on board. 68% of those surveyed say they somewhat or strongly agree that there should be a new pipeline through northern BC.
Canada just crossed a line many people once thought it never would. In the middle of an escalating trade war with Donald Trump's America, 68% of Canadians now say they support building a new oil pipeline to the West Coast. Not quietly, not reluctantly, publicly. This is not about Canada suddenly falling back in love with oil and gas. It is about something far more calculated. Faced with tariffs, trade threats, and political pressure from Washington, Canadians are signaling a shift in priorities. Energy independence now matters more than political comfort. And that shift should make the White House uneasy.
So what's driving the support? It's the trade war.
Given the trade relationship that we have with the United States, people are willing to compromise on climate change right now.
The catalyst for this moment is a new national Ipsos poll that reveals how sharply Canadian public opinion is changing. A clear majority now supports a new pipeline through northern British Columbia to the West Coast. Even more striking, an overwhelming share of Canadians say the country should expand oil and gas exports beyond the United States. At the same time, concerns about emissions remain real, but many respondents say they are willing to accept trade-offs in the short term. What is driving this change is not ideology, it is anxiety. The trade war has reframed the pipeline debate. For years, these projects were trapped in arguments over climate policy, regional tensions, and regulatory gridlock. Today, the conversation is being pulled into a different orbit entirely. It is about economic vulnerability and strategic risk in a world where access to the U.S. market can no longer be taken for granted. This poll is not about one piece of infrastructure. It is about how Canadians are reassessing their place in a more confrontational North American economy.
Donald Trump's trade doctrine is built on pressure. Tariffs are meant to force compliance. Uncertainty is meant to scare partners into line. But Canada's reaction points in the opposite direction. Instead of retreating, Canadians are asking a question Washington did not expect. What happens if the United States stops being our default customer? That question alone represents a strategic shift. When 83% of Canadians say exports should move beyond the U.S., they are not rejecting America, they are rejecting dependency. In trying to tighten control, Trump's trade war may be accelerating Canada's search for alternatives. This is where pipelines take on a new meaning. For decades, energy infrastructure in Canada was framed almost entirely as a climate issue. Today, it is increasingly framed as a national security issue. When nearly all of Canada's oil and gas flows to a single market, that market holds power. When that market weaponizes trade, that power becomes dangerous. A West Coast pipeline would not instantly replace U.S. demand, but it would create options, and in trade wars, options matter more than volume. They weaken threats, reshape negotiations, and reduce vulnerability. Steel and concrete may look boring, but in this context, they represent leverage. There is a deeper political shift beneath this poll. It shows how Canadians are redefining economic sovereignty. For years, Canada traded access for stability, assuming the U.S. market would remain open and rules-based. That assumption no longer holds. Trump's trade posture has delivered a blunt lesson. Dependence is not partnership, it is leverage. And Canadians are adjusting faster than policymakers expected. That is why the pipeline debate now feels different. It is no longer left versus right or west versus east. It is being reframed as national insurance. You may never need to use it, but without it, your negotiating position weakens instantly. Even in British Columbia, where resistance has historically been strongest, support remains solid. The question has shifted from whether Canada likes oil and gas to whether Canada can afford to stay boxed into a single export route while trade pressure remains unpredictable. The poll also reveals an internal tension. Canadians have not abandoned climate concerns. Many worry that expanding oil and gas production could raise emissions beyond control. Critics argue there is no immediate business case and no company currently proposing a pipeline. Those objections remain valid. What has changed is the hierarchy of risk. In the face of trade instability, many Canadians now see economic exposure as the greater danger. That does not mean the country has chosen oil over climate. It means Canadians are temporarily prioritizing resilience over idealism. Politically, that matters. It creates space for conversations that were previously untouchable. It signals to investors, regulators, and foreign partners that Canada is more open to strategic infrastructure than it once was.
From the U.S. perspective, this shift lands at an awkward moment. America has long benefited from Canada's lack of export alternatives. Reliable Canadian energy flowed south, reinforcing U.S. energy security while limiting Canada's leverage. Now, Canadian voters are signaling something new. They are preparing for a future in which access to the American market is uncertain and conditional. This is not hostility, it is adaptation. Trump's trade war was supposed to strengthen America's hand. Instead, it is encouraging allies to hedge against it. It is important not to overstate what this moment represents. There is no pipeline approval, there is no construction timeline, there is no immediate economic payoff. Canada has not won anything yet. But what has changed is more subtle and more consequential. Public psychology has shifted. Once a country starts planning for alternatives, it never negotiates the same way again. That alone alters the balance of power. This moment also sends a signal beyond Washington, to Europe, to Asia, and to global energy markets. Canada is quietly indicating that it is serious about optionality. Not reckless expansion, not an abandonment of climate goals, but a recognition that strategic infrastructure and environmental ambition cannot exist in separate silos when trade becomes a weapon. For Ottawa, this creates a narrow but real window. Public opinion is no longer the hard stop it once was. The question is whether political leadership moves fast enough to translate sentiment into credible long-term strategy before external pressure intensifies again. So, does this poll help Canada in its trade standoff with Trump? Yes, but not in the way headlines usually suggest. It strengthens Canada's negotiating posture. It expands political flexibility. It signals to Washington that pressure tactics have limits and unintended consequences. Trump wanted leverage. What he may have created instead is resolve. Resolve to diversify. Resolve to rethink energy strategy. Resolve to prepare for a world where the U.S. is no longer the only door that matters. And that leaves one uncomfortable question hanging over the entire debate. If trade wars are meant to make America stronger, why are they pushing America's closest allies to plan for life beyond it?
Canada just made a move that redraws the map of North American power. While Donald Trump spends another week battling corporate backlash over tariffs and economic uncertainty, Mark Carney has quietly delivered one of the most consequential breakthroughs in decades, a pathway for Canada to ship its energy directly to Asia without relying on the United States. A new Pacific pipeline, a united business sector, and a national strategy that blends AI with energy. This is Canada stepping out of America's shadow, and Washington knows it.
Pen finally to paper. A long-rumored memorandum of understanding was officially signed Thursday. Most notably, it'll open the door to a new crude pipeline from northern Alberta to the Pacific.
Today is a great day for the people of Alberta and for all of Canada.
The idea is to eventually move at least 1 million additional barrels of oil a day.
The announcement came in Calgary, where Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith signed a memorandum of understanding that lays the foundations for a new pipeline from northern Alberta to the British Columbia coast. For the first time in a generation, Canada is preparing to build an export corridor aimed not at the U.S. market, but at Japan, South Korea, India, and the rapidly growing economies across Asia. Reporting from Reuters confirmed that the project could eventually move up to 1 million barrels of oil per day, instantly transforming Canada's position in global energy markets. The political atmosphere around the signing was just as remarkable. Carney walked into a luncheon of more than 1,000 business leaders and received a standing ovation. Even AP News noted how unusual that moment was for a Liberal Prime Minister in the heart of Canada's oil country. The agreement doesn't just open a path to the Pacific, it reshapes federal and provincial responsibilities. Ottawa agreed to freeze its emissions cap for the oil and gas sector, adjust the tanker ban on BC's northern coast, and suspend clean electricity rules that Alberta said were blocking investment. Alberta, in return, signed on to expand industrial carbon pricing and fund a major carbon capture system known as Pathways Alliance. And in a surprise move that signals where Canada is heading, Alberta committed to building thousands of megawatts of AI computing capacity, aligning perfectly with Carney's ambition to make Canada an AI superpower powered by clean energy. This is not one deal, it is a blueprint for a new economic model.
Canada's pivot toward Asia is more than a strategic adjustment. It represents the end of a long-standing vulnerability. For decades, America acted as the bottleneck through which Canadian crude was forced to flow. Pipelines ran south, refineries were built south. Pricing power and political leverage sat firmly in U.S. hands. Trump leaned heavily on this imbalance. His tariff threats worked because Ottawa had nowhere else to send its oil. The lack of alternatives boxed Canada into a one-market reality. A Pacific corridor changes that reality entirely. By opening the door to a diverse set of Asian buyers, Canada can negotiate from strength rather than fear. The dynamic between Ottawa and Washington becomes more balanced. Instead of being a junior partner in continental energy politics, Canada positions itself as a global supplier capable of serving multiple regions. Trump's ability to use energy as a political weapon is weakened the moment Canada gains another outlet.
This is where the psychological shift emerges, and it is one of the most important elements of this pivot. For decades, Canadian policymakers operated under the assumption that geography locked the country into a one-way relationship with the United States. That assumption shaped trade, diplomacy, and even national identity. By targeting Japan, South Korea, India, and emerging Southeast Asian markets, Canada steps into a global arena it long hesitated to claim. This isn't just diversification, it is a statement of maturity. It signals that Canada is ready to compete on equal footing for global demand. This new confidence will shape investment decisions, inspire long-term partnerships, and create opportunities that were unimaginable when the U.S. controlled every negotiation point. With Asia in play, Canada's leverage increases, the U.S. loses strategic grip, and the continent's power balance shifts in ways Washington can no longer fully control.
But this realignment isn't happening only in energy. Carney's insistence on weaving AI infrastructure into the agreement reveals a broader strategy. AI requires enormous amounts of power. Alberta's resource base, combined with Canada's clean grid and supportive federal incentives, gives Canada a unique position. While Trump's America faces grid challenges, rising hardware costs from renewed tariffs, and tech sector frustration over immigration limits, Canada is constructing a model where energy supports AI supports industrial growth, and industrial growth supports export diversification. This integrated model is not just an economic plan, it is a competitive advantage. By pairing abundant energy with predictable policy, Canada offers the stability that global tech investors crave. In contrast, the U.S. is stuck in short-term political cycles that constantly disrupt long-range planning. This gap will only widen as AI demands accelerate worldwide. It is a cycle the U.S. cannot replicate easily because its internal politics have become too fractured to sustain long-term planning.
Carney's reception in Calgary underscores this contrast. In Canada, business leaders are rallying behind a government that offers clarity and direction. In the U.S., major sectors are increasingly alarmed. Manufacturers warn that Trump's tariff strategy is raising costs and undermining competitiveness. Tech firms object to restrictions that make talent harder to recruit. Farmers are suffering as China, India, and others shift purchases to Brazil and Argentina in response to U.S. policy unpredictability. Even traditionally conservative business coalitions are openly expressing frustration with Washington. The domestic atmospheres in the two countries are diverging: stability in Canada, turbulence in the United States. For global investors, that contrast matters.
It matters even more for geopolitics. America's historical leverage over Canada depended heavily on being the dominant buyer of Canadian crude. If Asian refiners begin securing long-term contracts, and early signals indicate they will, then U.S. refiners lose their privileged position. Canada becomes a supplier with options, not a captive exporter. And once that happens, Washington's traditional pressure points begin to disappear. This shift does not isolate Canada from the United States. It liberates Canada from being defined by it. Instead of reacting to American decisions, Canada is shaping its own economic future and building partnerships that align with a global, not continental vision.
Canada has entered a new phase, one defined by confidence, diversification, and strategic independence. By opening direct access to Asia, resetting federal regulations, and tying AI development to industrial growth, Carney is building an economy that can thrive no matter who governs in Washington. Trump, meanwhile, is learning the limits of America's influence in a world that no longer revolves around a single superpower. As Canada moves toward Asia, strengthens its business alliances, and embraces a unified national energy AI strategy, the old assumptions about North American power are breaking apart. The real question now is whether the United States can adapt to this new environment, or whether Canada's pivot marks the beginning of a geopolitical shift that Washington never saw coming.
So far, we know 5 of the new ones. 3 are critical mineral mines, 1 in Quebec, 1 in Ontario, and 1 in New Brunswick. Critical mineral extraction is a priority for this government. In the recent budget, it earmarked $2 billion for the sector over 5 years.
Canada is home to some of the largest reserves of critical minerals in the world. We have lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth elements. They're all widely available here.
Canada just made a move that Washington can't brush off. While Donald Trump doubles down on tariffs and shouts about restoring American manufacturing, Ottawa has quietly taken control of the one resource that could decide the future of the entire electric vehicle race: nickel. And thanks to Prime Minister Mark Carney's new federal budget, Canada is no longer just supplying nickel to the world. It's positioning itself as the clean nickel powerhouse that both Europe and the United States desperately need. For Detroit, this isn't a theoretical policy problem. It's a direct threat to America's EV ambitions, its trade strategy, and even its national security posture.
At the center of the story is Canada Nickel Company, the Toronto-based developer behind the Crawford Nickel project near Timmins, Ontario. This is not a routine mining proposal. Analysts at Corporate Knights described Crawford as one of the largest new nickel opportunities anywhere on the planet, a massive, low-carbon operation designed from the beginning to supply battery metals for North America's clean technology industries. Reuters reported as early as 2021 that Canada Nickel had already been in discussions with senior U.S. officials about serving as a secure supplier for the American electric vehicle sector. Back then, the conversation was forward-looking. Today, it has become an urgent strategic reality. Crawford's development timeline now intersects directly with the world scrambling to secure stable mineral supply, with the U.S. under Trump slapping broad metal and battery tariffs on virtually every trading partner, including Canada. This is the environment in which Mark Carney dropped his new federal budget, a document that places critical minerals at the core of Canada's economic and geopolitical strategy. Billions are being committed to mining, refining, and value-added production inside Canada. Ottawa is no longer content with simply digging resources out of the ground and shipping them south. Carney wants domestic refining, domestic upgrading, and domestic control over Canada's most valuable strategic assets.
All of this lands at the exact moment when the United States, under Trump's revived America First doctrine, is tightening trade restrictions on metals, batteries, and EV components. The collision between Carney's critical minerals strategy and Trump's tariff strategy is not the coincidence. It is the defining economic clash of the decade.
Nickel is the metal everyone in Washington talks about behind closed doors. Without it, there are no long-range batteries, there are no high-performance electric SUVs, and there is no American claim to leadership in the next industrial revolution. The U.S. hasn't built a reliable domestic nickel supply chain in decades. For years, it quietly leaned on imports from Canada, which historically provided more than a third of America's entire supply of primary nickel. When Trump decided to impose tariffs of 20 to 30% on imported battery metals, he wasn't just going after Indonesia or China. He was hitting the very country that keeps Detroit's battery factories alive. That's where the new problem begins. If the U.S. cuts itself off from Canadian nickel, it doesn't fall back on some abundant American resource. It falls back on Indonesia, where Chinese refiners dominate the industry, and where the environmental footprint is so high that any vehicle built with that nickel will face punishing carbon penalties in Europe once the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism fully kicks in. In other words, Trump's tariffs risk forcing American automakers to choose between paying more at home or paying more abroad. Either way, the EV becomes more expensive and less competitive.
What makes Crawford so disruptive is not just its size, but the quality and strategic value of its nickel. This is clean, low-carbon metal that global automakers desperately need as emission standards tighten. Its production profile puts Canada in a category almost no other supplier can match, and Carney understands how critical that timing is. By placing critical mineral processing and value-added production at the center of his budget, Carney is elevating nickel from a commodity into a national strategic asset. Canada is signaling that it will move up the value chain. Instead of being the continent's ore pit, it intends to be the continent's refinery, upgrader, and long-term supplier of choice. This shift gives Ottawa real influence, the kind of influence Canada rarely had in previous decades. The consequences for Washington are immediate. If the U.S. pushes too hard with tariffs, Canada has the option to redirect supply toward Europe, South Korea, and Japan. Those markets are aggressively locking in clean nickel contracts and are already preparing their industrial strategies around low-carbon inputs. Every ton that Canada signs away to the EU or Asia is a ton the United States cannot easily replace, especially if it wants to avoid Chinese-dominated supply chains. Trump cannot ignore this because nickel touches every strategic sector the U.S. is trying to protect. The EV industry is just one piece. Nickel is crucial for military jet engines, naval systems, advanced alloys used in aerospace, and even high-density grid storage. A shortage here isn't like a shortage of lumber or furniture. It is a shortage that affects national security, international competitiveness, and America's long-term technological leadership. And the timeline matters. The U.S. is heading into the 2026 USMCA review with Trump demanding concessions from Canada and Mexico. Carney now walks into that negotiation with something Canada hasn't had in decades: leverage. Canada controls the most attractive nickel project in the G7, backed by a federal government that is openly investing in processing capacity and openly engaging with European and Asian partners. If Trump wants to keep American EV manufacturing alive, he needs Canadian nickel. If he wants to export those EVs into the EU without facing carbon penalties, he needs clean Canadian nickel. If he wants to reduce dependence on China, he needs a non-Chinese supply chain, and Canada is the only scalable option. This isn't resource nationalism, it's geopolitical realism, and Trump knows it.
What Mark Carney has done is simple but powerful. He has turned nickel into a national advantage, and he has done it at the exact moment when the U.S. is most vulnerable to supply chain shocks.
Canada isn't trying to pick a fight with the United States, but it is no longer willing to play the role of passive supplier while Washington weaponizes tariffs against its own allies. The question now is whether Trump will adapt or escalate. Will the U.S. choose stable cooperation on critical minerals, or will protectionism push America into deeper dependence on China and higher costs at home? And more importantly, if Canada's nickel becomes the key to North America's EV future, who really holds the leverage in the next chapter of U.S.-Canada relations? Canada has already made its move. Now the world waits to see how Washington responds.
We have to focus on what we can control. We can't control, I can't control Donald Trump, I gotta tell you. Actually, I can't let him think I'm controlling him is maybe a better way to do it.
The lights of Brampton shimmered in gold and violet as Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped onto the stage of the Trillium Diwali Gala. What seemed like a simple cultural celebration quickly became something more. Surrounded by community leaders and half his cabinet, Carney used the language of light and generosity to deliver a message that reached far beyond the hall. His words marked a turning point in how Canada faces the pressure from Washington. While President Donald Trump tightened tariffs and pulled manufacturing jobs back to Illinois, Carney stood before Canadians with a different vision, one that didn't rely on confrontation or retaliation, but on strength from within. Over the past year, Trump's aggressive trade policies have reshaped North America's economy. His administration imposed tariffs of 25% to 100% on a wide range of imports, including steel, aluminum, autos, and heavy trucks. The stated goal was to protect American industries and bring production home. Instead, it fractured long-standing trade relationships and left allies scrambling for stability. In that context, Carney's Diwali speech became more than a festive address. It was a declaration that Canada will endure and adapt, even as its largest trading partner grows unpredictable.
Is we have to take care of each other. We can give ourselves, and we are beginning to give ourselves more than the Americans can ever take away.
Carney outlined 3 lessons Canada has learned through this turbulent year. Each one, while wrapped in optimism, was grounded in a hard political reality. The first was about control. We can't control what happens outside our borders, but we can control what happens here at home. Behind that simple line lies an entire economic strategy, redirecting focus inward. The Carney government has launched an ambitious plan to expand national housing, develop new trade and energy corridors, and invest in infrastructure designed to reduce dependence on U.S. routes. The second lesson was about solidarity. Canada's middle class and industrial workforce have been directly hit by Trump's tariffs. When Stellantis decided to move Jeep Compass production from Brampton to Illinois, about 3,000 Canadian jobs were lost. In response, Ottawa introduced tax cuts on income, capital gains, and first-time homebuyers, while committing support programs for displaced workers in auto manufacturing and steel. The message was clear: Canada will protect its people, not through retaliation, but through resilience. The third lesson centered on security. In the days leading up to Diwali, Carney's government announced the hiring of 1,000 new border officers and 1,000 new RCMP agents, alongside stronger laws against home invasions, car theft, and human trafficking. These actions were framed as part of a broader effort to defend Canada's sovereignty in an age of global uncertainty. By the time Carney reached his closing remarks, it was evident that this was not just a cultural speech, it was a political roadmap disguised as a celebration of light.
The results of this quiet strategy are starting to show. While Trump's tariffs were meant to push jobs and capital into the United States, they have produced unexpected effects across the border. According to Statistics Canada, manufacturing investment within Canada rose by nearly 7% in the first half of 2025, with significant growth in clean energy, construction materials, and logistics. The federal government has channeled more than 12 million Canadian dollars in community fundraising through initiatives like the Trillium Foundation, which now supports major projects such as the new Peter Gilgan Mississauga Hospital, set to become the largest in the country. International investors are also taking notice. European and Asian firms seeking stability are increasingly choosing Canada as a regional base, citing predictable regulation and political moderation. While American ports remain congested by tariff bureaucracy, Canadian trade corridors through Vancouver, Halifax, and Montreal are handling record container volumes, according to Transport Canada's August 2025 report. Carney's government is capitalizing on this momentum. His fiscal team is working to expand domestic production incentives while diversifying trade with partners in Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Pakistan, countries that have all signed bilateral deals with Washington this year but maintain active ties with Ottawa. In short, what began as defensive adaptation is turning into a strategic transformation. Canada, once vulnerable to every economic tremor from Washington, is learning to stand on its own.
The brilliance of Carney's approach lies not only in economics, but in symbolism. The Diwali festival celebrates the triumph of light over darkness, hope over despair. Carney used that symbolism to craft a narrative of national confidence, a Canada that unites faiths, cultures, and provinces under one purpose: to remain strong, true, and free. His remarks also carried a subtle rebuke of Trump's worldview. While Washington leans on confrontation and protectionism, Ottawa emphasizes inclusion and long-term vision. Where Trump's speeches often paint America as a victim of unfair trade, Carney's message is about self-determination. By invoking community service, generosity, and shared purpose, Carney projected an image of stability and maturity. In doing so, he positioned Canada not as America's junior partner, but as a model of democratic endurance in a time of global volatility. For ordinary Canadians, the meaning is clear. Even in an era of trade wars and shifting alliances, the country's strength lies not in retaliation, but in its ability to adapt and rebuild. The irony is striking. Trump's tariffs were designed to make America stronger and its neighbors weaker. Yet, nearly a year into his second term, evidence suggests that the strategy has backfired. By imposing blanket import duties of 25 to 100% under Section 232 and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, Washington triggered inflation and disrupted supply chains. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the World Trade Organization have both warned that these measures are raising domestic prices and discouraging investment. American automakers now face higher component costs, while construction firms report delays and shortages of imported materials. Meanwhile, the very industries Trump hoped to control, autos, energy, and steel, are facing competitive pressure from an increasingly self-sufficient Canada. The Stellantis shift, once hailed as a political win for Trump, now looks like a temporary gain overshadowed by Canada's broader industrial realignment. In North America's new balance, Canada's calm persistence contrasts sharply with Washington's volatility. Trump built walls of tariffs, but Canada built corridors of trade. Trump relied on pressure, while Carney relied on partnership. And in that difference lies the quiet reversal of power. The Diwali Gala in Brampton will likely be remembered as more than a celebration. It was a signal to both Canadians and Americans that the old order of dependence is fading. From the glow of festival lamps emerged a new idea of economic independence, one not defined by reaction but by renewal. And as the crowd rose to applaud, the message became unmistakable. The light that shines from Canada's stage is now illuminating the cracks in Trump's economic fortress.